Hi there and welcome back. My apologies for the delay in getting this video out. I've been extremely busy all week, saving Managed Democracy and Helldivers 2, and just about managed to pry myself away to get this next model painted. And up today we have the absolutely awesome Commander Farsight model, which has to be one of the most dynamic and coolest models on the Tau range. And I've been really looking forward to painting up this model in the black armour style. I did, however, make quite a few mistakes during this painting process, which really frustrated me during the process, but I guess that's all part of learning. But for now, let's get into the painting. We're going to be using the same paints as I did in my previous video where I dry brushed a strike team. Only difference is, because this is a much larger model, I am going to be using the airbrush for this one. But the principles are pretty much the same, and the end result is going to be very similar as well. So we're going to start off with priming the model in black, and then we're going to be building up our highlights using the same three colours, which are Skavenblight Dinge, the Fang, and Fenrisian Grey. And the first step is to take the Skavenblight Dinge and to spray that on to about 90 to 95% of the entire model. And just really come at it at all angles with the airbrush, really only leaving the deepest recesses in the black primer. And a big shout out to the commenter in my last video who asked why in the painting process the model looks so light in comparison to the final picture. And after doing some investigation and testing, I realised I was using way too much light during the filming process and was way too overwhelming and was blowing out all of the colours and recesses and shadows on the model. And hopefully, due to the new tweaked settings that I'm using, you're going to be seeing a more accurate representation of the model during the painting process. So a big shout out and thank you to Halo 3 Power who pointed that out. Next up is to start to highlight up all of the armour plates on the model. And to do that, we're going to be using Citadel the Fang. And again, I'm going to be using the airbrush for this. And I'm just going to be coming in and hitting all of the armour plates with this colour, making sure we don't miss any out, as there are quite a lot of small armour plates randomly placed throughout the model. And just try and get a nice 90% coverage on all of the armour plates, including areas like the backpack and the shield, just really leaving the recesses in the previous grey colour. And don't worry too much about being too accurate here and getting any overspray onto the rest of the model, as any of the other parts of the model will be getting painted up later. And we're also going to be using the weathering pigment later on as well, which is going to help to blend everything in anyway. And if you don't happen to have an airbrush, don't worry, as all of these highlighting stages could easily be done with a dry brush, as that's one of the benefits of using the weathering pigment. You don't necessarily have to be neat and tidy and have smooth transitions, as the weathering pigment will do a lot of that work for you. Next up is to apply the final highlight layer to all of the armour plates, and as usual we're going to be using Citadel Fenrisian Grey. And unfortunately I missed the beginning part of this process in the filming, but I did manage to capture some of it towards the middle and end. And this highlight step should only really be applied to all of the top parts of the armour plates on the model. And we want to make sure that we do leave at least around 50% of the previous fang layer, and just be more selective about where you're placing this final highlight layer, as you don't want to overdo it here and over highlight the entire model. Now that the armour plates have been highlighted, it's time to paint up the rest of the model. And to begin with, we're going to be painting up all of the body parts that are not armour plates. And to do that, I'm going to be using Vallejo Oily Steel. However, if you don't have this particular colour, you could just use any kind of dark metallic colour instead. And the idea here is that we want to be painting up all of the areas on the box art that are black and painting them in here with the Vallejo Oily Steel. Now, you don't have to paint absolutely every single part of the box art that is in black, as long as you get the larger areas. As the smaller areas, you're not really going to notice as much. And I believe I used a little bit of water here just to thin the paint slightly, so I get a nice smooth coverage over all of the parts that I'm painting. And there's no real special technique being deployed here, I'm just applying one coat to all of these areas. Next up, I wanted to apply some further highlights to the kind of long scrolls that are dangling off of the armour on the model, with the idea being here that these areas should be a lot more white in comparison to the rest of the model. So I just used some white ink to highlight these areas up. I also decided to apply some white highlights to the sword as well, in preparation for it getting painted up with yellow contrast paint. And this was one of my first errors, as I really didn't apply enough highlights here and left way too many dark areas on the sword. You don't really see it here, but when I do go in to apply the contrast paint later on, it just really doesn't work, as the area is too dark and it's not been highlighted enough. And this is just the beginning of the troubles that I had with painting the sword. But I'll get into more of a rant about that later on. But for now, I also went in with this same white ink and applied just a few spot highlights to the very top areas of the model. And this mainly included the shield, the head, the arms, and the backpack as well. Next up is to use any white of your choice to paint in all of the areas that you want to have in your accent colour. And it's really up to you what areas you paint in white here. But in my case, I went for all of the circular parts of the armour plates, the raised parts on the shield, and also some of the fins on the jetpack and helmet as well. And by doing this, we're going to get a much nicer coat when it comes to applying the contrast paint a bit later on. And now is the time where we do apply the contrast paint to all of the white areas. And the choice of colour that you go for here is completely up to you. I went for Army Painter Zealot Yellow. And I started with the sword, and unfortunately this is where I started to run into some issues. For some reason the white highlights underneath were showing through, really patchy, and also the dark recessed areas were also way too dark for this, and the yellow contrast paint wasn't strong enough to cover it really, and it ended up kind of going a kind of awful yellowy green colour, which just really didn't look good at all. So I decided just to kind of leave it for now to dry and paint in all the rest of the accent parts, and then go back and sort it out later. The rest of the yellow areas worked out not too bad, and I was fairly happy with them. I do, however, think that they may have turned out slightly better if I didn't use contrast paint and maybe just used normal standard paint and highlighted them up the normal way. I find the contrast paints can sometimes be a little bit inconsistent and patchy, even though they are very convenient. And if I was doing this in the future, I would most likely not go for using contrast paint. And in terms of how I fixed the sword, I had thought the contrast paint had dried and went to apply a coat of white paint, but unfortunately the white reactivated with the contrast paint and it went yellow, and even after applying the white 3 times, the sword was still yellow. And white paint was actually starting just to act a little bit weird and clump up in places, and to be honest, I thought the sword was ruined. And I was at the stage where I thought I was going to have to strip the whole model. But I gave it one more attempt with the airbrush this time, and I just airbrushed the entire sword white. And once that took and it dried, I then airbrushed the Zealot Yellow over the entire sword, and then applied some ice yellow highlights to some of the kind of edges of the sword. And after that entire fiasco, it actually looked not too bad, so I decided to leave it. I'm definitely not happy with it, but it definitely could have turned out a lot worse. And in terms of how I recommend you guys paint this up if you were following this tutorial, is just to paint the entire sword white and then apply the contrast paint on the white and be done with it. It would have been a lot less hassle and fuss than what I had to go through. And now that the sword and all of the accent colours have been sorted, it's time to add the weathering pigment, which is going to help shade the entire model and smooth out all the transition highlights in the armour plates. And as this is already pre-thinned, I'm just going to be adding it straight out the bottle onto the entire model. And you want to use a large brush here if you have one, and just apply it to the entire model. And you don't need to do anything special here, as the weathering pigment will just work its way into all of the recesses by itself. And once the model's completely coated, you can then go in with the solvent and wick away any of the excess weathering pigment. Just take a clean brush and dip it in the solvent and use that to wipe away the weathering pigment from any areas of the model that you want. And you just want to make sure that you're constantly wicking the brush off onto a paper towel every time you go in and remove any of the weathering pigment. And you just want to do this to all of the raised and highlight areas on the model. And just take your time going around the model, removing any of the excess pigment from these areas, and just leaving the pigment in all of the recesses on the model. And you should notice that the weathering pigment is darkening everything and smoothing out all of the transitions on the highlights that we made earlier on in the armour. And once all the excess weathering pigment has been wiped away, you just need to leave the model for a few hours to dry, and you should be left with a really nicely shaded model. And it's a really simple and easy process to do, and the weathering pigment honestly does most of the work here. I even really like the way it shaded the kind of white scrolls that are hanging from the sword and from the leg of the model. So much so that I'm actually interested to see how this weathering pigment would work on a white model rather than a black model. So that's something I may try out in the future. But apart from that, the model is pretty much done at this stage. The only thing left to do is to add any edge highlights that you want to add. And I just used some Vallejo Ice Yellow to highlight the sword and some of the raised areas of the yellow accent areas. And I also used a bit of Fenrisian Grey to edge highlight any of the armour parts. And once that was done, the model's ready to be based. And if you want a full video tutorial on how I painted up my bases for my Tau army, you can check out my previous video on how I painted my Tau strike team. Next up, I believe I'm going to be finishing up the rest of the Tau Combat Patrol, which are the big battle suit and the 2 hero models as well. And there's loads of other projects that I have upcoming in the pipeline. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of those videos in the future. I am currently trying to push for 1,000 subs, so your support would be greatly appreciated. But in the meantime, happy painting, and I'll catch you in the next one.